Hi, my name's James Rowlands. I am a researcher at Sussex University, where I'm doing a PhD looking at domestic homicide reviews, and I also chair domestic homicide reviews, and that's what I want to talk about really, in men's status in them. So for people who don't know, domestic homicide reviews are conducted after someone has been killed or has died by suicide, and it's domestic violence related. And obviously, in the majority of those cases, that those are women who are killed or have experienced domestic abuse by men. And what I want to talk about really is the absence of men, often paradoxically, in domestic homicide reviews, and just reflect on that briefly. I guess in starting doing that, I want to acknowledge my debts. A lot of what I'm going to be saying is not something I've come up about. It's based on the work of activists, campaigners, mostly women, often feminist, and of course the women who have lost their lives to domestic homicide as a result of men's violence. And I think what's really interesting in domestic homicide reviews and really troubling is this paradox that although men usually, although not exclusively, are the cause of that death, they're often quite invisible. They almost have this invisible status. And it's very curious because they've caused the homicide, really. But somehow, when we do domestic homicide reviews, we often, and certainly when we talk about them, we often lose focus on men specifically. We often end up talking about them as individuals in a way that doesn't contextualize their violence and abuse, doesn't link it to wider society and how that is understood in terms of men's violence. So, for example, we often think of male perpetrators as either mad or bad, and we don't think about them as being one example of men's violence and abuse. And we often end up actually focusing on women. We often focus on the victim of that homicide and make them kind of responsible for men's behavior, or perhaps the things that they did or didn't do, which are seen as somehow the cause of what happened to them. And I think that's really problematic, that we lose track of men in a lot of these things. And in DHRs, we go on to publish them, and they may make really important recommendations about policy and procedure change or training, but often we don't link that to gender and how gender is working in our society and how men's violence is working. And we also often don't talk about how men came to use violence and abuse in the first place, which is what some of the other speakers have talked about. How is it those men who've gone on to kill their partner or whose acts have led their partner to die by suicide, how did they come to the place where they thought violence and abuse was acceptable? How come they came to the place where their friends and families weren't calling out what they did? And I think we need to interrogate that more if we're really going to understand and really have a conversation about men's violence against women and girls. And the other reflection I want to make is, of course, I chair domestic homicide reviews and I'm a man. And I think that's something some other people have touched on too, is I think we need to think about what we are doing as men in this field. What I think Stephen talked about, how we can be complicit in male violence or certainly in gender norms, whether we want to or not. And the reality is we often benefit from those, again, whether we want to or not. So what is it that we have to do to be a good ally? How do we need to think about how we conduct ourselves and work in those spaces? And I guess I want to kind of end with a reflection and ask, why is it so easy for us to forget that men are responsible for this violence? Why is it really easy for us to lose the big picture of men's violence and just focus on that one violent man who we describe as mad or bad? And it's because it's easier. And it also is because it hurts. It hurts to talk about men's violence and abuse because it means we need to stop and think about where we are within that and the people we love are within that. And that's something which is really challenging and something that we need to think about, and why men have to be part of the conversation as much as women. So I guess my question really is, how do we keep the focus on men's violence? How do we keep that both individually, but also systematically and systemically? And how do we do that in a way where we are a good ally? So how are we in that space? What work can we do? What work should we be doing? And how do we do that as a good ally? And I guess I want to end with a quote by Bell Hooks, who talked about this idea of active struggle. So it's about taking our share of the work and not speaking over women, but assuming responsibility for transforming our consciousness and as well the consciousness of society. So on that note, I think I'm at 5 minutes, or at least my alarm's just gone off. So